Okay, so while I'm about to start, I want to say that I am talking for 40 minutes. If you have questions, I'd much rather them, because it's like a lot of topics, I'd much rather answer questions as we go. Raise your hand, I can repeat the question. If it turns out I get too many questions, then I will either say, let's save it for the end, but do not be, but do not be shy to ask questions as we go. I'd much rather talk about things where people are curious than things where no one has questions. Okay, on that note, here we go. I'm talking, actually, just to start, I'm going to be talking focusing much more on the acquisition stage than the analysis part. And I wanted to start with a challenge. So there was a recent article published by Wold and Palomini that was titled, Impacting the Effect of fMRI Noise Through Hardware Acquisition Choices. And I should also say this, I don't think this was actually ever mentioned. There's a new special issue of NeuroImage about where this article is from that Kevin and Molly have put together, which has a lot of articles on this topic, and I think it was just like officially released as an issue like a day or two ago. Yeah, so make sure everyone knows it looks really good. So here's one of the articles, and I'm not going to talk about the science in this article. I'm going to talk about the first sentence of their introduction, which is, applied to intensity fluctuations of a pixel in fMRI time series, the term noise is so nonspecific and carries such negative connotations that it should be eliminated from the fMRI vocabulary. And the reason I call this a challenge is because they hate the term noise, but at the same point they put the word noise in their title. So they can't get away from it. And we're stuck with this very unclear, messy term. And I would say that the most challenging and of like the methodology arguments I've had over the years, the most unpleasant and challenging methodology arguments come down to one person saying, I have a new method. It reduces noise a lot. And someone else says, no, it reduces this type of noise a lot, and you're making this other type of noise worse. And the argument goes back and forth, really not about what reducing noise is, it's what type of noise you're reducing is more important. And that seems to be a repeated issue in the field. And from the teaching perspective, it means that someone can give this talk with the exact same title and give you completely different topics. So there's so much to cover that I'm sampling it, and hopefully it's an interesting sampling. Now, when you talk about noise, just to give sort of rough definition, it could be measurement noise, which I'm going to categorize as thermal noise. So you put a phantom of oil in the scanner and the signal isn't perfectly constant, so that noise. Or flaws in image reconstruction. It could be undesired signal fluctuations, roughly like physiological noise is most of this: breathing, pulsation, head movement, non-compliance of your tasks, unmodeled neural effects, unmodeled aspects of your hematoc responses. And kind of fitting in between the two of these as a hybrid is what we kind of talk about often: temporal signals noise, which is how much the signal varies over time, and contrast to noise, which is how big of a response you get over the noise. So I'm dividing most of my talk into these three sections: preventative scanner health, peripherals and participants, and parameters and pulse sequences. Some people might think that noise acquisition is really all about parameters and pulse sequences. I'm going to try that topic could be an entire fMRI physics course is that, which we're not going to do here. I'm going to try and balance a little bit between the three of these, mostly on the second two. So for preventative scanner health, things that you can think of to reduce noise acquisitions are regular quality assessment scans, overall evaluations of results, and real-time data observation. So QA scans are something that whoever runs your center probably does and you don't really think about if you have someone running your center. But it's something just to be aware of that's happening and something that's worth checking once in a while. So just as an example, at the NIH intramural program, what it looks like is essentially every morning on every scanner, they put an oil phantom in. For every receiver coil that we regularly use, they collect a really basic parameter set, and they save the reconstructed data, sometimes the raw data, and then they try and record it. So we get these time series. This is TSNR over different days, and the left panel is, I guess the left panel. Oh, there's a mouse here, nice. So this panel is just showing an example of how TSNR varies over 4 of the scanners. This one we're reconstructing by every receiver coil And you can see there are spikes. These huge spikes are most likely an issue with data collection, not like something horrible on the scanner. But you can see there is variation over time. And if you see them go way off, it's much better to notice it here than after you've collected a month of data. The other thing which I think is getting a little bit easier to do is regular evaluation of your own results. So as an example, there's this new package, MRI QC. The links are at the bottom. And what this is you're collecting an anatomical image, and if you save it in a certain format, you can upload it with this normative data set and see where your data falls. So, if you're looking at a CNR measure, this happens to be an anatomical scan. If you look at your CNR measure, and the scan you just collected is up here for for this distribution of population, that instantly tells you there's something wrong. And sometimes something wrong is the bad volunteer. Sometimes something wrong is this is your first warning that the scanner has an issue. The last thing, which I think is most important to end users, is real-time, just checking your data as it goes. So this is a picture from the AFNI software real-time interface, where you're collecting data, and you see the fMRI time series at this location at the bottom. You see the motion parameters up here, and you see the brain. And as you're going, the person's head moves, and the person's head keeps moving. So just seeing this in real time, at minimum, you could say, okay, there's a problem with this data set. At best, if you see it fast enough, you can tell the person, we got to recollect that run, and you've just saved a whole session. Similarly, real-time or soon after real-time observation is a great monitoring tool. So in this case, you're seeing the respiratory artifacts. There's this program in AFNI called Instacore, which, whether or not you use AFNI for anything else, is a phenomenal program where you can just browse your time series and do instant correlations as you move around. And you click on a large vessel, and suddenly you're seeing a lot of the CSF and large vessels activated. That gives you a good hint that there might be a breathing artifact in your data. And that instant correlation is also a good way to find these scanner artifacts. So interestingly, I think this is the same receiver coil data set that Cesar was showing, but this is a different artifact. So here the artifact was a big drop, and it looked different in his data set, but it was the same issue. And if you look over time, what you noticed is it's not sensitive to gray and white matter. It covers a very large area. And when you do a correlation of the area, you see that it's not varied by tissues, it's varied by reason. And this was a damaged receiver coil. One of the coils in the channel was damaged. And I just also wanted to use this slide to answer one of the questions from at the end of the talk, which is if you have a spike, doing these instant correlations is a good way to sort of check the issue. So if you think you've resolved the issue and you're doing correlations and you're still seeing big blobs of activity like this, that's one way of saying, no, there's something else still there. Now I'm going to switch to the second of my 3 points, which is peripherals and participants. And I'm dividing this in. For peripherals, I'm going to focus a good bit on respiration and pulse, a little bit on eye movement and head movement. I'm not going to focus at all on multimodal neuromeasures, but I did want to mention them here because even though you might think that EEG isn't noise, that's adding data to our study, or galvanic skin response, that's not noise, that's data. Noise is anything you're not modeling in your analysis. So let's say you're doing EEG and you're getting an awareness measure, an alertness measure. If you didn't collect that, you wouldn't know alertness, and there'd be a variance in your data that you weren't aware of. So collecting that data is neural, but it's also a way to control noise in your data set. So the main point I'm going to try and make here is for monitoring is collect respiration and pulse data. So Cesar gave a great overview of some of the methods in post-processing to remove physiological noise. There's retro-ICOR, there's respiration volume over time, there's heart rate measurements, and I think these methods really should be considered. But one thing I've heard time and time again is, well, I'm using ICA or something else. I don't need to collect. I'm not using those methods, so it's really not that important to collect respiration and pulse. If there's any take-home message from my whole talk, I don't want to hear that again. And the basic answer is knowing what your volunteer is doing is essential, whether or not you're actively using these in your post-processing. So this study by Rasmus Byrne and Kevin Murphy took this wasn't the goal of the study. The task was a block design lexical word non-word task. So you show a few letters on the screen, and is it a word? Is it not a word? And this wasn't like designed to be a hard task. This wasn't Twitter words which may or may not have interpretations of what they are. This was just regular words or regular gibberish. Or phonetic gibberish. But if you looked at respiration volume changes over time, so the blue lines on this plot are the block design, and the black line is the average respiration volume over time trace over the 10 volunteers in the study. And you could see there is actually a relationship in this very simple task, where when they are doing this task, they take deeper breaths than when they're not doing the task. Since I'm not talking about post-processing here, I'm not going to go into the details of the study, but I should note, this is related to Lauren's question in the last talk, that this is a study that sort of addresses the exact issue you were talking about of if you have task-correlated respiratory noise, what are the approaches to deal with it? And they do suggest a few things in there. So hammering this point home again, this is a minor confession. This is a study I published a while back. It was a population study, young versus old. Part of the study was I was doing a flashing checkerboard, eye movement, hand movement task, where every 18 to 24 seconds, a 200 millisecond stimulus appeared. They pressed a button, they moved their eyes. And I have this nice pretty figure where we have these 4 regions of interest. You see the response change in the young and old population, and it looks great. So the confession is that this study had an unpublished part. The unpublished part was, I wasn't just looking at sort of these impulse response functions. I wanted to look at stimulus duration. So I wanted to see, is there an age effect, whether I'm showing short stimuli versus longer. So in sort of a lot of the hemodynamic response literature, there's some fundamental studies showing it's additive. I wanted to see if it changed. But I ran into a problem. Stupid me, I collected my respiration data. And because I collected my respiration data, I noticed that a non-trivial number of my volunteers held their breath for however long the checkerboard was going on. So if it was a 3-second checkerboard, they kind of skipped a breath. If it was a 6-second checkerboard, they held their breath for 6 seconds. If it was a 12-second checkerboard, they held their breath for 12 seconds. And again, this is not a taxing task. This is looking at a flashing checkerboard and pressing a button. And if people don't know, a breath hold is possibly the most potent bold activator that you can do without like other tools. So it causes heart rate increases sometimes. It will cause increased CO2, which causes global blood flow changes, which will cause the entire brain signal to change, 10% bold, 20% bold. So when you're having like full breath holds modulating with your tasks, you lose anything useful from the data. Okay. And most important, if I hadn't collected that data, I would have published some really great pictures. Because I would have seen a great scaling effect as things went longer. But that scaling effect would not have been what I was aiming for, which was the response to this task. It would have been my first breath holding study. And as I was putting together this slide, I did have a scary thought, which is, there's some really fundamental papers in this area which do different duration. And they were done really before people were thinking of respiration. And I'm trying to think if there's any of that literature that was done where people checked if their subjects were holding their breath. So if anyone's looking for a not very exciting but really important and easy study, there it is. So I hope you're not getting too sick of this topic yet. So the other example was, this isn't just bold. This is, we collected some serial blood flow, so ASL data. And this is what an ASL response typically looks like. So we have, are the colors visible there? Yeah, I guess they're a bit more visible there. So you have bold in blue, where you have, this is a flashing checkerboard task, and your CBF in red. Your bold signal, in this case, is going up 5%. Your CBF signal is going up 30%. This is classic this is what we want to see in a CBF response. But the point of the study was not just to do checkerboards. I was actually using breath hold as a measure. And when I did breath hold, I got this. So in this case, they're holding their breath for this dark area, and they're doing paced breathing here. And I'm seeing this crazy triple response, not in bold, but in CBF, that is almost as big as the breath hold. So we looked at this, and we said what was going on. And we said it might have to do with the paced breathing. So we ran some data that was just paced breathing, so that we had them breathe in and out every 3 seconds for, I think, 2 or 3 minutes. And we said, what do they look like? So this is averaged over 2 breathing cycles. So this is the breathing cycle. When you do ASL, you're collecting a tagged image and a control image, a tagged image and a control image. Then you sort of interpolate to match up, and then you subtract, and that's your flow measure. And what you could see here is that even though they're just doing paced breathing, there's no task really, this whole brain signal is having this little, sine wave to it too. And what we then did is we did this exact same sequence, but we shut off the tagging. So in reality, it's the exact same thing, on and off, on and off, on and off. And this is what it looked like. So with this pulsed arterial spin labeling sequence, when you're having people take deep breaths, just whenever they're breathing in, the signal is lower, and whenever they're breathing out, the signal is relatively higher. So just the chest movement was causing a huge artifact in the spin labeling data. So one last slide on the respiration and pulse recording is, when you're talking about, if you're collecting this data, it's important to think about it and do it right. The simple things like make sure your traces are connected to acquisition time. I've had someone come up to me who collected an immense amount of data, a connectome project's worth of data, let's say. And after they collected that much data, they were like, okay, we're having synchronization issues. How do we fix it? And they were able to fix that, but that is not a conversation you want to have. So there's, either using the scanner hardware or using sort of external systems to record your triggers. If you're going to collect this data, make sure it's linked to what you're actually doing. Just really basic things like for the respiration traces, the equipment that often comes with MRI scanners, they're designed to do gated MRI, which means, they want to know when your chest is fully out or fully in. They're not concerned with your time series. They're not concerned with the depth. So certain vendors will auto-scale that over time and, adjust your signal. So check if that happens. I think still on Siemens, the default is that auto-scaling, which can be turned off. Understand what the response you're seeing is on your belt. So when they're filling up their chest, is the signal going up? When they're releasing their chest, is the signal going down? That also varies by system, and it just makes sure that you're aware of what's happening. Similarly, for pulse oximeters, it's really this gating concern, and making, from the clinical perspective, it's gating maybe and making sure your subject's alive. So if you miss a pulse or two, or you have a weird artifact in your signal, the systems aren't designed to really care about that. So spending the time to make sure the pulse oximeter is stable and is not going to mess up your signal every time they wiggle their finger a little bit is worth the time. There's many ways to do this correctly. One way that I've found works is I sort of have the Velcro pulse oximeter. I wrap stretch tape around the finger to keep it on the finger tighter than the Velcro would allow. And then I tie another piece around here to keep it tight there. And this is, there's other ways to do this. This is really basic. But giving the thought when you're setting up to do this right matters. And also monitor traces before and during scanning. Like the minor confession study I had earlier, I noticed that they were holding their breath while that data was being collected. So you know right away if there's an issue. One more tangentially related topic is a lot of the stuff we've talked about here is on just pulse oximeters. But there's been a few studies, mostly linked to Blaise Frederick, where they use near-infrared spectroscopy on fingers or toes. And that's essentially the same thing as a pulse oximeter, but you're collecting a wider frequency band, which lets you more quantitatively measure total oxyhemoglobin. And what they're showing is, what they're showing is you have the dark signal, the solid lines are this oxyhemoglobin in the finger, and the dashed lines is bold, and you can see there's a lot of similarities. And when you correlate the two, you're seeing just straight signal, just a small time shift. You're seeing a lot of correlation that actually varies a little bit by subject. So I think very few people are doing this right now because it's not as standard hardware, but it's not that difficult to do, and it's something I haven't done yet, but we're seriously considering trying to play with a bit more because it could be a potentially really rich data set. And I'm not talking about a lot of the other semi-neural measures, but I wanted to bring up eye tracking as something to consider for noise reduction. So here's a study from Katie Chang, where they were in primates, where they were just doing correlations from open versus closed eyes. And that's sort of a measure of alertness, and they do a correlation of that, and you can see that there's a lot of correlation depending on whether the monkey's eyes were opened or closed. And like I said sort of at the beginning, this variation may actually be neural. I mean, alertness is a neural measure, but the fact that you know when the monkey's eyes were opened or closed and when it's alert or not is, quite relevant to your task. I also want to bring up head movement. So Cesar talked about this. We're going to hear more and more about head movement. Head movement is everyone's favorite topic in the noise world of MRI. But a lot of that's focused on post-processing. And this should go without saying, but less head motion when you're collecting your data means you don't have to worry as much about removing head motion in post-processing. And this is particularly important because head motion does vary systematically across populations. There's studies showing this in children versus adults. There's studies showing this in other clinical populations. And I don't care how good your post-processing is. If you have a systematic population-based difference, you're starting in a hole. And the more you can do to avoid that to begin with, the better you are. And I can't really go into every single way to restrict head motion. Just the best advice I can give here is don't assume that the way you saw someone else do it is the best way. Both for two reasons. One is that the best restraints vary by the person's head size. Are they a child or are they adult? Is it worth doing a practice scan in a mock scanner? Things like that. And also, there's more and more options. So I'm just showing pictures of two options that didn't really exist when I entered the field that we've had some luck with. These are sort of foam cushions that you can fill up with a bit of air, and I found these work quite well. And some people I'm working with are starting to play with these, which are milled foam. Essentially, you do a 3D model of an individual volunteer's head, and you mill the foam to fit that person's head precisely. And that seems to work well. There's obviously logistical issues with that. But these new options are out there, and the logistical issues might be too much to make this practical, but if you're bringing in a rare patient population and you have one shot at them, doing something like this might be worth the alternative. Yes? Question?
Do you have any qualitative assessment of the case score, just how it feels for the participant? Because I've just seen a lot of people recommending it, but no one said like, I had this on me and it felt like off. Mm-hmm.
So I have not seen a quantitative study yet. Yeah. So I know one of my coworkers has been playing with it more than I have, and what he said is it is comfortable. I think he decided to get his hair cut a little bit shorter before he started to use that, so I don't know if that was necessary or not. But the way they do it is they put like a shower cap, a swim cap on your head first to get the model of your head, not your hair, and that helps it fit a bit better. But it was comfortable, and this particular coworker of mine is notorious for moving in the scanner, and they got good data from him. So, like I said, I don't know if this is the solution or a solution, but it has promise. I'm not promoting any specific brands here. I was just putting up an example. Lastly, in this section is prepare participants. These are really basic things, but I've seen too many times people don't think about them, which is take the time to make sure they know what's going on in the study before they go in. Make sure they're comfortable. the more feedback you get from a task is better. So if you're doing button presses, recording that information is much better than not recording that information. And this is one of the issues with classic resting state studies, in that we don't get that information, and it makes a lot of these peripheral scans like pulse, respiration, EEG, eye movement, all the more useful if you do get them. And the last point is noise is not independent from task design. So there are two recent studies. This is the first one, which is just saying how much do people move their head during different tasks. So the leftmost side, so this is frame-wise displacement for control, ADHD, bipolar schizophrenia. The leftmost side is resting state. The rightmost side is a go, no-go task. And what you could see is there's variations across all populations on how much they move. And unsurprisingly, when you have someone sit in the scanner and don't tell them to do anything, they move a lot more than when you engage them. Not a lot more, but they move more than when you engage them. And this effect actually goes across age. So this is all adults. So there's an age effect in adults, but for each of these tasks, you could see that it's a robust finding. So at every age, resting state is having someone move their head a little bit more than some of these other tasks. And I was actually surprised. So a go, no-go task is a bit intense, and I kind of expected that to like cause movement because it's a bit stressful, but it turns out that engagement actually keeps head stiller, more still. And this is essentially, these, I would call this a replication, but these were pretty much going on in parallel. Here's another study with children and adults showing head motion, and again, resting state has a big variability. Showing a movie has the least variability, and showing this set of images called inscapes, which I don't know if I get in trouble, it's a glorified screensaver, but it is somewhere in between, where it just gives someone to engage while they're looking at the scanner. So I think one thing to keep in mind here is, the field has pushed a lot towards resting state. And I think more and more we're showing that there are limits to resting state that should be considered when you're deciding what's the best task. So now the last section. Any questions before I go into the last section? Yes?
Yes, I was wondering, you had shown there were differences in motion for just looking across the air
Mm-hmm.
to looking at a movie. How does that actually play in terms of actual change in brain activity? So actually looking at a movie, does that actually change how you...
So looking at a stimulus is going to be different than looking at nothing. Yeah? Oh, sorry. What's going to change when you're looking at a movie versus looking at nothing? So looking at a movie is definitely going to give you different neural responses. People like Uri Hassan has done a lot of work on natural viewing movies, how it looks differently. The idea of that inscapes was to sort of be this in-between, where it's supposed to be a set of stimuli that are sort of not very consequential, not arousing any emotions, not doing anything huge, but still give some amount of engagement. And the group doing that is optimistic that it is stable. So that the paper that I referenced on this previous slide is a good one to read on that topic to learn more. So last section. Yes, one more? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's very important that they do only one section.
Uh-huh.
And how do I know when I move too much and
Mm-hmm.
rerun it?
So the question is, you're looking at movement amounts online, and you want to know at the end of a run, is that so bad that we need to do it again? That's a hard question. I don't think there's any clear rule. The two measures people talk about, and I think Jonathan might cover this a little bit in his, which is, how many just spikes of motion do you have in your data set, and how much just general drift. So if they're moving, I think a rough rule of thumb is if you're seeing motion bigger than a voxel, whatever your voxel is, that should be very concerning, like regular motion. If you're seeing more than a half of a voxel, that's something to think about. And That's a rule of thumb. I don't think it's a hard, fast rule, but that might just give you some sort of baseline to start with. I think I'm going to want to go to the third section, and then if we have time for questions at the end, I'll continue. So I'm going to be talking about a bunch of semi-random stuff here. I'll be fully honest, because there's so much in this area that I could have, any of us in the room could talk a whole lot on this. So I'm hopefully going to give you a taste of the ways to think about acquisition and pulse parameters. In general, there are different priorities. So response shape versus sensitivity. Do you care about anatomical accuracy? Do you care about general artifacts? Do you care about artifacts that are going to bias between two populations? What are your priorities is going to depend on what you choose. And the optimal options aren't always obvious. So I have a question for this room. What is the best flip angle for an fMRI study? Kevin can't answer this.
I don't know.
69. Okay. Yes? Thank you. Both of you are giving the exact answer I wanted to hear. That's wrong. That's exactly, thank you very much. So the Ernst angle is if you put, a jar of oil in the scanner, what is going to give you the maximum signal to noise for a given parameter set? It's the flip angle. So if you look at this plot, this red line is signal to noise, and the very peak of that is what would be, this flip angle would be the Ernst angle for this data set. But for fMRI, we don't care about signal to noise as much as we care about temporal signal to noise. So how stable are things over time? And it turns out that physiological noise, so if you want to look at TSNR, one way to model it is your signal to noise over the square root of 1 plus lambda squared times SNR squared. And lambda is a measure of the amount of physiological noise your parameter set has. And what this means is if your data has enough physiological noise, like the brain, then when you increase your signal to noise, you're increasing both the numerator and denominator. So if you look at this TSNR plot, it does go up and down, but it's a lot flatter. So there's actually a huge range of flip angles where TSNR does not vary that much. And what this looks like in practice is if you're doing a flash and checkerboard task at a bunch of different flip angles, so black is the Ernst angle. So if you look at the raw magnitude responses, you can see that by raw magnitude, the black response is the biggest, and everything else is scaled. But then if you scale them all the same, you see that the TSNR, or the contrast noise, which is essentially how much these wiggle, are the same, pretty much for almost all of these. So across this wide range of flip angles, it really doesn't matter. And there are reasons to push low flip angle. You get better gray and white matter contrast. You have less to deal with inflow effects because you have less spin history artifacts. So there's reasons to push. But the irony is this is so counterintuitive that this study says you can essentially go down to like 10 or 20 flip angle. And no one I know, even the people who wrote this paper, actually regularly do studies at a flip angle of 10 because it feels weird. I mean, there might be other reasons too, but it just getting that low SNR just feels weird even though we know it. And a point I'll bring up later is what this really says is when you're talking about acquisition, it's not just SNR, it's what is more sensitive to physiological noise versus temporal versus thermal noise too. So for general parameters, this is sort of a rough run through. Voxel size, smaller voxels is lower SNR, but smaller also means you might, you get more specificity, which might actually give you higher TSNR in the areas you care about. TR, shorter means lower SNR, but better temporal resolution, which might also give you higher TSNR. It's better at filtering high-frequency artifacts. There's been a lot of push that, we just sample super high TRs and then we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. There are minuses to doing the super high TRs, and I am actually increasingly skeptical that, I might be sort of an outlier in the field, but I think that if you're using some of these other methods like RetroICAR or RVT and getting better quality data, as opposed to sort of pushing things as short as you can, you might actually get better data sets than really pushing your TR low. This is speculation as opposed to hard data right now. And the last area a lot of people talk about is acceleration, which I'll roughly say is collecting an incompletely sampled data set and estimating what was missing during reconstruction. And depending on which method you use, you sometimes get lower SNR, but it can get your TR shorter, your voxel smaller, and it makes multi-echo practical. I think multi-echo is a great thing to consider. I'm not talking about it at all in this talk because we're going to get a whole other talk on it. You can potentially get less susceptibility and dropout. But the thing to keep in mind that I think is under-discussed is most acceleration methods have not, reconstruction is not a solved problem. And there's issues with it. And if you don't think about those issues and evaluate your specific data, you can be in for surprises. So one such surprise, so the GRAPPA sequence, which is an in-slice acceleration method on Siemens scanners, by standard, the way these sequences work is they collect a full case-space image to essentially calibrate the reconstruction. And then when they collect partial data sets, they use that full sequence as part of reconstruction algorithm. And the method they used was sensitive to some phase errors. And this is what, in this specific data set, this is an example of what the reconstructed data look like raw. And when you do a more robust calibration image using a technique called flash, so this is the exact same acquisition. You're just changing the calibration scan. And this is how the image looks. So you also see, in addition to sort of just the general neatness, you see this artifact here and here that are just going away. So just changing that calibration scan, which most people never think about, made a difference. So this is the type of issue that people think about. Other things that are kind of behind the scenes that aren't always considered are what happens in fat ghosts in various studies. So this is another study using breath hold, which is my favorite and most hated task. One of the reasons it's my favorite task is because if you're evaluating a new pulse sequence and you want to see anything that's wrong with that pulse sequence, have people do the breath hold task, because it will turn up every single artifact that could possibly happen. Why I hate it is that exact same reason. It will turn up every single artifact that could possibly happen. So this was my breath hold scan, and this is the mean signal using a vaso sequence. And if you see this little mark here, but if you take the standard deviation, you see this massive amount, which was essentially the fat was shifting to slightly different locations over the duration of the breath hold and made this horrible artifact in my data. And what Laurentius Huber and I did, he's the pulse sequence, he did the pulse sequence part, I can take credit for giving him the bad data, is up that fat stat essentially to the SAR limits, and then that effect went away. So this was a simple change in the pulse sequence that we had to know to look for. Another example is a lot of people talk about simultaneous multi-slice, but there are issues. So in SMS, you're collecting these two slabs line by line over time, like this. And what that means is there's this point in the middle where they merge. And if I sort of cover that point, the two images, actually, you wouldn't really see that line. The only reason you see that line is because there's just a slight contrast difference between the beginning and the end. And if someone moves, you are moving right along that line. And if you do your motion correction, you're seeing that come through. And no amount of post-processing is going to get rid of that effect. I should say that these are vaso data, which is not typical bold MRI, so it's making it a little bit worse than you would see in bold. And this was, again, from a breath hold study, where we saw a subtler version of this effect. Actually, I should also show. So this is what the breath hold looks like. So this is, on that middle slice, this is all artifact. I should also say we were seeing a subtler version of this artifact. The maps were looking like this, so we told the subject to run it with a little bit more breathing and see what happens. But when we switch to a 3D EPI sequence, which is collecting sort of everything across space, the data is going to be a little bit smoother. There's a little bit more spatial smoothing, but the motion isn't going to cause the same effect. And then we see what we really want to see with a breath hold response, which is beautiful global response between a lot of the gyri. And again, the best pulse sequence interacts with a lot of stuff. So this is an example of 2D EPI versus 3D. So this is SMS versus essentially the sequence that they're just showing in the last page. And if you're talking about 3 millimeter voxels, SMS, which is what's most popular nowadays, is much higher temporal signal noise. We're getting a nice robust response in this motor task compared to 3D. If you're going to this regime, which is 1.5 millimeter voxels, it's a little bit closer with 2D EPI still winning out, being a bit more robust. But then if you go to really small voxels, 0.75 millimeters, here you're seeing that the 3D EPI for everything else equal is really giving us much more beautiful responses. And that's because it's the two types of parameters are interacting with thermal versus physiological noise differently. And the low end is much more sensitive, and it's much more better. It's when thermal wins out, the 3D EPI works much better. So I am out of time. I want to save some time for questions.
We have a few more minutes.
I have a few more minutes?
Some questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So another thing just to think about it in pulse sequences is, again, is you gotta think about what is most interesting to you. So this is one way of we normally think about gradient echo bold, which is primarily sensitive to large veins, the blue. Other sequences like a diffusion weighted prep is more sensitive to small vessels. Vaso is much more sensitive to a combination of the large arteries and the small vessels. So depending how focal you want to get, these different sequences are options. This is pulse sequence stuff. You can look at this later if you want. The slides are available. And this just sort of gives you a sense of what they look like in this motor cortex at different resolutions. So gradient echo bold gives us this big, robust response, but it's going into the CSF and all this stuff. It's not really specific. You look at some of the other sequences like diffusion weighted prep, which gives you a really focal response, but it's noisy and barely distinguishable. And one way to show this is you can make a plot of these different sequences on sensitivity. So how likely it is to find an activation, and gradient echo bold is on the top, which is why it's so popular. But if you really want to get this high-level specificity, these other sequences sort of follow a curve towards less sensitivity, more specificity. One reason my colleague Renches Huber likes Vaso is it kind of it's away from the rest of these curves. So it's not as sensitive as bold, and it's not as specific as some of these others, but it still has strong sensitivity. So he and I have, particularly him, has been playing a lot with it. There's real-time methods to motion correction. This is just an example of an anatomical with and without real-time motion correction. There's a lot of calibration methods. This was a study I did where the same volunteers, young and old, we did a saccade task, we did a breath-holding task, and you see there's population differences between young and old. And if you divide it out, you see that even though there are population differences, some of them still stand. So there's a lot of other literature out of this. There's examples doing calibration with enriched gas breathing, simple tasks, the standard deviation of resting state scans. Even if you're not doing full calibration, sometimes these can be good sanity checks. I think the one minus is they do take away from scanner time of interest, which has limited their popularity, and relatively few clinical studies have used them. One reason I'm using my own study here is because I get to self-promote a little bit. But the other is there really aren't many studies that have tried these methods with a population like young versus old. So there aren't that many examples. And in summary, there's noise from many sources, and understanding what these sources are is going to help you correct them. Thank you.